I survived enemy fire, insurgent traps, and night patrols in a war zone. But nothing prepared me for what I walked into when I got home. My wife was walking down the aisle, in white, and my best friend was waiting at the altar. Major Thomas Wolf Hawthorne's return home was nothing short of dramatic. A highly decorated soldier, Thomas had spent countless nights in the harsh terrains of Afghanistan, knowing all too well the unpredictable nature of combat. However, nothing could prepare him for the sense of unease that overtook him as he disembarked from the military transport plane at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, 2 weeks ahead of schedule. As the familiar runway stretched out before him, Thomas instinctively felt that something was off. He had imagined this moment countless times, the reunion with his family after a long deployment, but as his calloused fingers scrolled through his phone, the stark reality set in: no messages, no calls, no responses to any of his communications over the past month. At first, he dismissed it, attributing it to the unreliable connectivity in the field. Yet, a nagging instinct, one honed through years of military experience, warned him that something was terribly wrong. The base, typically filled with the constant hum of military operations, felt eerily quiet. There were no distant explosions, no radio chatter, no perpetual state of readiness. Just the sound of civilian vehicles and base personnel going about their routine duties. The unsettling silence seemed to amplify the feeling that something was amiss, heightening Thomas's already acute sense of alertness. As he made his way toward the taxi that would take him to his home, Thomas's thoughts shifted to his son, Nathan. The last time he had seen the boy, Nathan was just 6 years old. Now, Thomas was returning to a life he had missed, eager to make up for the time lost during his deployment. But his mind also lingered on the small changes he noticed as the taxi passed through the familiar streets, the new businesses, altered traffic patterns, subtle shifts that indicated time had moved on in his absence. When they finally arrived at his suburban home, Thomas's instincts went into overdrive. The front yard, once meticulously maintained with Grace's beloved rose garden, had been replaced by generic shrubs that seemed strangely out of place. The house, while neatly kept, appeared less lived in. It was as if the essence of what made it their home had been slowly drained away. The elderly neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, stood frozen on her porch, her expression morphing from shock to pity as she met Thomas's gaze. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but then quickly retreated inside her house, leaving Thomas with a deep sense of foreboding. With a heavy heart, Thomas approached the front door. The key turned smoothly in the lock, but as he entered, the house felt wrong. The walls, once adorned with family photographs documenting their shared life, stood bare. The familiar scent of Grace's favorite vanilla candles was replaced by a sterile emptiness. His deep voice echoed through the house as he called out for Grace and Nathan, only to be met with a haunting silence. Within moments, Nathan's voice cracked with emotion as he rushed down the stairs. The reunion, though filled with the joy of a long-awaited embrace, was not without its underlying tension. Nathan, his small frame trembling in his father's arms, clung to him with unusual force. Thomas, ever the soldier, kept his composure, but something in his son's eyes, a weariness that no 8-year-old should carry, signaled that the reunion would not be as simple as he had hoped. "Where's Mom?" Thomas asked, though he already feared the answer. Nathan's entire body tensed at the question. After a brief, painful hesitation, Nathan's words hit Thomas like a blow: "Mom's at church, getting married." The revelation struck like a physical blow. His wife, Grace, was marrying Steve, the very man who had been his supposed best friend for years. His mind raced, piecing together the timeline of their betrayal. His training, which had taught him to control his emotions in the most harrowing situations, now served him in a personal crisis that was far more intimate. Despite the emotional blow, Thomas kept his focus. He needed to be strong for Nathan. With a military precision that came naturally to him, he turned to his son and asked, "Do you want to come with me to the church, or would you rather stay here?" Nathan's response was immediate and unwavering: "I'm coming with you, Dad. I want to see their faces when they realize you're home." As they drove toward St. Michael's Church, Thomas's mind shifted from shock to strategy. The mission before him was not one of war zones or enemy combatants, but one of justice and consequences. His training had prepared him for everything, from the brutal realities of combat to the silent battle that now lay ahead, one fought not with weapons, but with the truth. The closer they got to the church, the more Thomas's mind sharpened. He wasn't just going to confront the people who had betrayed him. He was going to show them exactly what it meant to betray a soldier. His son's small hand in his only strengthened his resolve. He would not let this betrayal stand unchallenged. As they approached the church, Thomas felt his instinct sharpen, like a wolf on the hunt. This was no longer just about family, it was about making sure that the truth, the full weight of it, was known. It was about showing Grace, Steve, and everyone else that betrayal had consequences they would not escape. The doors of the church swung open with a resounding crash, and Thomas stepped forward, his presence filling the space with authority. Grace stood at the altar, Steve beside her, both dressed for the wedding that was meant to mark the final betrayal. The wedding march screeched to a halt as the congregation turned to face the man who had come to deliver justice, not just to his family, but to everyone who thought they could tear his life apart without facing the repercussions. "Let me congratulate the happy couple," Thomas said coldly, his voice cutting through the stunned silence of the room. "And thank my loving family for their support while I was away." The fallout had begun. Thomas was no longer the man who had been left behind. He was the man who would make sure everyone knew the cost of betrayal. The moment Nathan spoke, the foundation of Thomas's world began to crack. "Mom's at church, getting married." The words hung in the air, stark and raw, and for a brief second, Thomas didn't quite register the weight of them. He thought he had misheard. How could it be true? His wife, Grace, the woman he had promised to protect and love, the woman who had once been the center of his universe, was marrying someone else. And not just anyone. His best friend, Steve. His heart raced as his mind struggled to process what his son had just revealed. Nathan's voice quivered as he spoke further, adding the unimaginable. Steve, the man who had stood by him through thick and thin, was now part of the betrayal. The truth hit like a tidal wave, overwhelming and cold. His mind swirled with disbelief, struggling to keep the military discipline he'd spent years honing. It wasn't supposed to be this way. He had spent 2 years fighting to protect his family, and now it felt as though everything he held dear had been stolen from him. "How long has this been going on?" Thomas asked, his voice strained but steady, though his world had just been upended. Nathan didn't answer immediately, but when he did, the details spilled out like jagged pieces of glass. Steve had been coming over more frequently once Thomas had deployed, and Grace, the woman he thought he knew so well, had changed. Photos of their life together, their memories, had begun to disappear. Grace's touch, her warmth, had been replaced with a stranger's absence. The pieces began to fit together, each new revelation a shard of the betrayal that had been hidden behind a veil of excuses and distractions. Thomas's military training kicked in, forcing him to focus on the task at hand. He couldn't allow himself to be consumed by the storm of emotions flooding through him. His son needed him now, more than ever. "Nathan," he said, looking down at the boy, his eyes meeting his with a fierce intensity. "We're going to make things right. I need you to be strong for me, okay?" Nathan nodded, though his face betrayed a sadness that no child should bear. The anger, however, was something Thomas was determined to control. He had seen too much chaos, too many lives destroyed by unbridled emotion. This was not the time to be reckless. This was a war, but it was a different kind of battle. His hands clenched, but he kept his composure. He would confront this betrayal, not with rage, but with precision. "Do you want to come with me to the church?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. Nathan, his small hand trembling in his, whispered, "I want to see their faces when they realize you're home." A plan began to form in Thomas's mind, sharp and methodical. He wasn't just going to confront the man who had betrayed him, he was going to show everyone exactly what it meant to break a man's trust, to destroy a family. It wasn't just about vengeance, it was about sending a message, making sure that no one ever thought they could tear apart a soldier's life without facing consequences. The car ride to the church felt like an eternity. The weight of the situation bore down on Thomas, but his mind stayed sharp, his thoughts calculated. This was not a battlefield filled with the chaos of war. This was his home, his family, and he was going to fight for both. Steve had no idea what was coming. He thought he had won, thought he could betray a man who had given everything for his country and his family. But Thomas had spent his life training for moments like this. He would not let this go unanswered. As they neared St. Michael's Church, the familiar sights of his neighborhood flashed by. Every turn felt like another step toward a confrontation he never imagined he'd have to face. His grip tightened on the steering wheel, his jaw set, and his mind already prepared for what lay ahead. "Are you angry, Dad?" Nathan's voice broke through Thomas's thoughts. Thomas glanced at his son, the worry evident in his eyes. "Not at you," Thomas replied. "Never at you. But yes, I'm angry at the people who should have known better. The people who should have protected this family, instead of tearing it apart." His words were measured, cold, but they carried the weight of everything he had fought for. As the church came into view, Thomas's heart didn't race with fear, it raced with purpose. This was it. The confrontation. The reckoning. He had been in dangerous situations before, but nothing could have prepared him for the personal devastation that lay ahead. He wasn't just going to expose the betrayal, he was going to make sure that Grace, Steve, and everyone else who had chosen betrayal over loyalty would never forget the cost. The church parking lot loomed ahead, filled with the cars of those who had chosen sides. The silver Mercedes that Grace drove, the sleek cars of their friends, all reminders of the life Thomas had once thought was unshakable. But now, as he parked the car behind the church, it all felt like an illusion. His family was gone, and the people who had supported him were now the ones standing in the way of justice. He turned to Nathan, his voice steady but filled with authority. "Listen carefully, son. What's about to happen might make people angry. They might try to tell us we're wrong, but I need you to remember this: everything I do to protect what's right. Do you understand?" Nathan nodded solemnly, his young face hardening with determination. Thomas took a deep breath and, together, they stepped out of the car. The church's imposing doors loomed before them, but Thomas wasn't afraid. He had already faced the worst. Now, he was going to make sure that the truth came to light. The moment the doors swung open, the wedding march screeched to an abrupt halt, and Thomas stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room. There she was, Grace, standing at the altar, a vision of betrayal in her white dress. And beside her, Steve, his so-called best friend. The man who had stood by him in battle. The man who had destroyed everything Thomas had worked for. "Let me congratulate the happy couple," Thomas's voice rang out, steady and filled with cold fury. "And thank my loving family for their support while I was away." His words sliced through the stunned silence like a blade. The room froze, and Thomas walked down the aisle, each step deliberate, calculated. Nathan walked at his side, his small hand firmly grasping his father's. Every person in that room was complicit in the betrayal, and Thomas wasn't going to let any of them escape unscathed. Grace's voice finally broke through the silence. "You weren't supposed to be here," she said, her voice trembling as she clutched her bouquet. Thomas's gaze locked onto hers, his voice cold. 2 years, he said, his words filled with quiet rage. 2 years I spent in combat zones. 2 years I spent fighting for you, for this family. And this is what you do?" His eyes shifted to Steve, whose confident demeanor was now slipping away. "Brothers don't betray each other," Thomas said, his voice a low growl. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. And then, without warning, Thomas's fist connected with Steve's jaw, sending him sprawling across the altar steps. The silence was broken by gasps, followed by a chaotic rush as people scrambled to make sense of what had just happened. But Thomas didn't flinch. He had done what he came to do, expose the truth. Now, he was going to make sure it would never be forgotten. As the church settled into an eerie silence, the truth began to spread like wildfire. Whispers filled the air, cutting through the stunned congregation like a sharp knife. Thomas could see the shocked faces of the people who had once been so close to him, the ones who had turned a blind eye to the betrayal. His eyes narrowed as he turned away from the wreckage of the altar, his mind already focused on what came next. Each step was measured, deliberate, but his heart pounded fiercely. He had torn through the facade of what was supposed to be a fresh start, revealing the lies and the manipulation that had been festering beneath the surface for far too long. Now, as he looked down at Nathan, he saw a boy who was no longer just a child, but someone who understood the weight of loyalty and truth. Nathan's hand remained tight in his, a steady anchor in the chaos. "Are you proud of me, Dad?" Nathan whispered, his voice strong despite the tremor of shock that had rattled him to his core. Thomas looked down at his son, his heart full of pride and sorrow. "You did well, Nathan. You showed courage when it mattered." His words were simple but powerful. They had just begun their fight, not just for justice, but for the future of their family. Yes, Hamas is officially designated as a foreign terrorist organization, FTO, by the United States. The U.S. Department of State added Hamas to its FTO list on October 8, 1997, under Section 219 of the Immigration and Nationality Act. In addition to its FTO designation, Hamas has been listed as a specially designated global terrorist, SDGT, under Executive Order 13224 since October 2001. This designation reflects the U.S. government's assessment that Hamas engages in terrorist activities and poses a threat to the security of U.S. nationals and interests. Thomas was beginning to sense that the time for patience was coming to an end. After weeks of meticulous planning and gathering information, he could feel the weight of the approaching storm. As he prepared for the first phase of his plan, the stakes became clear: this would be no ordinary confrontation. This was about more than just seeking revenge, it was about exposing the betrayal in a way that would make sure everyone involved would face the consequences of their actions. The first steps were subtle yet impactful. Thomas used his legal leverage, working with his lawyer to file paperwork that would lay the groundwork for his public unveiling. At the same time, he dug deeper into Steve's business dealings, uncovering discrepancies that could undermine the foundation of his empire. Thomas knew that exposing Steve for the fraud he was would send shockwaves through the community, but he had a bigger goal in mind, making sure that every person who had played a part in his downfall would feel the full force of his retribution. It wasn't just Steve who was under scrutiny. Grace, who had abandoned their family, was a central figure in Thomas's plan. He started gathering evidence of her affair with Steve, carefully collecting text messages, photographs, and witness accounts. It wasn't just the emotional betrayal that stung, it was the calculated way she had used his absence to deceive him, to destroy the life they had built together. Thomas knew that exposing Grace's actions would shatter her carefully constructed image as the tragic military wife, and he was prepared to make it public. However, it wasn't only the affair that Thomas intended to reveal. He had to ensure that his family, who had chosen to side with his betrayers, would understand the depth of their mistakes. His parents, especially, had been complicit, turning a blind eye to the situation while quietly supporting Steve's rise. By bringing their complicity into the light, Thomas would not only ruin Steve's reputation but also the very foundation of the family he once held dear. As he prepared to take the next step, the tension within Thomas's household began to mount. Nathan, his son, was caught in the middle of a conflict he couldn't fully understand. He could see the strain on his father's face, the late nights spent working on plans that he wasn't old enough to comprehend. But Nathan wasn't naive, he understood more than Thomas gave him credit for. As they sat together, father and son strategized, preparing for what was to come. Nathan's loyalty never wavered, even as his own world began to crack under the weight of his mother's betrayal. The impact on the family was profound, but the emotional toll on Thomas was evident. He had never expected to find himself in a situation like this, fighting not just for his family but for his own dignity. The public fallout would be swift. When the first documents were released, they did their job, people started questioning Steve's credibility. His business empire, built on lies and manipulation, began to show signs of crumbling. Investors pulled out, and clients became wary. As more documents surfaced, the pressure on Steve intensified. But it wasn't just Steve who felt the heat. Grace's carefully curated image of the devoted wife began to crack. Her friends turned on her, and the school where she had taught for years became a battleground as the truth about her affair came to light. Meanwhile, Thomas's own family was beginning to unravel. His parents, who had never stood by him during his deployment, now found themselves the targets of public scrutiny. His father, once a respected businessman, was dragged into financial investigations, and his mother's social standing collapsed. His sister, Rebecca, was also exposed for her role in facilitating the betrayal. Her career in real estate suffered a blow from which it would never recover. For Thomas, the emotional toll was just as heavy as the strategic maneuvers he was executing. Every step, every move was calculated to ensure that no stone was left unturned. He had spent years in combat, learning how to navigate dangerous situations, but nothing had prepared him for the psychological warfare he was now waging against those he once called family. The path to justice wasn't just about punishing those who had wronged him, it was about ensuring that they never had the opportunity to rebuild their lives on the foundation of betrayal. Despite the mounting pressure, Thomas remained calm, his military training providing a steady foundation in the midst of the storm. Each legal maneuver, each strategic leak, was part of a larger plan to dismantle his enemies systematically. As the days passed, the weight of the consequences of their actions became impossible to ignore. Steve's business partners began to withdraw, Grace's reputation crumbled, and his family became increasingly isolated from their social circles. But the most significant moment was yet to come, the public exposure of everything they had tried so hard to hide. When the article finally hit the news, it sent shockwaves through the community. The details of Steve's fraudulent business dealings, Grace's affair, and the manipulation